Hi, I'm Ellen Fay, and I am co-lead on the Land Use for Net Zero Soil Health and Carbon Dynamics Group, and I am director at the Sustainable Soils Alliance. Pete.
Hello, I'm Pete Smith at the University of Aberdeen, and I'm the other half of the co-lead of the thing that Ellen's just described.
Brilliant. So we're going to have a chat today about soil carbon because Pete Smith is a great expert on this subject. And we've put together a list, a host of questions that we think Pete is really well placed to answer. So we're going to have a chat about that, and hopefully some pearls of wisdom will be made available to everybody. So, Pete, as somebody who's done so much work in this space, I'm going to start by asking a really basic question, probably to you, but maybe to some of us. Shedding some light on this nuance could be really helpful. So the first question is, what is the relationship between soil health and soil carbon? I guess, do they overlap? Are they distinct? And can one be used as a kind of proxy for the other? And how they kind of sit in the ecosystem idea about soil generally?
Yeah, great question, because we quite often hear a lot about soil carbon or soil health, but we don't necessarily hear about them together. And the answer is soil carbon or soil organic matter is a headline indicator for soil health. So soil health is to do with the health of the soil, its ability to support the ecosystem services and functions that it's meant to provide, and to continue to provide those out into the future. And that's more than just carbon, of course. So in terms of soil health, you have soil biology, soil chemistry, and soil physics. And soil carbon is really just one measure of soil chemistry, right? So if you measure the soil carbon, that's a measure of the soil organic matter that you've got. And soil organic matter is a very important indicator, a headline indicator of soil carbon, soil health. But it's not the only thing that you need to consider. You also have to consider the biological component. You know, does it support organisms, microorganisms, invertebrates, and such like? And does it also have a good structure? So what's the soil physics like? Do you have a good bulk density? So there are lots more things to do with soil health than soil carbon, but soil carbon is an indicator of soil health, just one of the indicators.
Yeah, would you say if you're kind of taking, a little collection, a little basket approach, that it would be those three that you might take as an indicator of soil health then?
Yeah, you need at least one indicator of the biology, one indicator of the chemistry, and one indicator of the soil physics. So you really need, soil organic matter would perhaps be one that you'd measure. Soil pH and nutrient balance is another chemical measure that you could use. For soil biology, the easiest one to make is maybe just the presence or absence of earthworms. That's easy for farmers to do on their own farms, in their own fields. But there are other things that you could do, which range from identifying individual organisms, which is a bit more difficult. You need to be trained in the sort of taxonomy of those organisms. And there's also the things that you can do with DNA, the metabolomics and such like, where you can get a detailed sort of breakdown of all the bacteria and fungi that live in your soil. But generally speaking, and in terms of the physics, of course, you can measure bulk density, and there are a number of other sort of physical measures as well. But bulk density as the physical measure, pH and organic carbon or soil organic matter as the chemical, and presence or absence of earthworms will probably gives you a good idea of whether you've got healthy soil.
And in your mind, is that a certain sort of layer of the soil? I mean, soil has different depths and different layers. Would you be thinking about the topsoil in your mind when you're thinking about that approach?
Generally speaking, yeah. Generally, farmers are interested. People who use the soil are interested predominantly in the topsoil, the top sort of 30 centimeters, or maybe even down to a meter, because that's where the action is. Yeah. That's the rooting zone where your roots are going to go to, and that's where all the nutrients and the water is going to be provided to the plants. So generally, from a farming point of view, it's the topsoil you're interested in. But you do have to take account of that, of course, because you don't get so many earthworms really deep down in the soil, so it wouldn't be a good measure, So there are different measures for different soil depths and for different soil types even. in croplands you don't get as many worms because you're constantly ploughing the soils, whereas in grasslands you tend to get more. So there are some nuances about the different measures that you can use.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, that takes me on to my next question, which is, when we're thinking about soil carbon, should we be thinking about it as a kind of blanket concept in relation to soils, or if we think about soil carbon content, should we be bearing in mind natural variations because of naturally varying soil types and even maybe landscape types? Is that an important consideration? Because quite often we're thinking of growing carbon in a place, soil carbon. Is that place also a consideration in terms of the opportunities?
It is, yeah. So we know that our cropland soils, because they've been continually ploughed over years, have lost between 40 to 60% of the original carbon that was in the soils when they were native ecosystems. And forestry systems, woodlands and grasslands contained far more carbon than is in the cropland soils. So there are very big differences between the land uses. And generally speaking, the grasslands and the woodland soils tend to be sort of closer to the natural system. They've got permanent ground cover, and you've got things growing there all year round, and they're not getting cultivated all the time. So that's what's happening in those soils that's different from the croplands. When you're constantly ploughing the croplands, and constantly taking away the material, leaving a fallow period, and constantly taking away biomass in the straw or in the grain, that's what's generally leading to this decline over time in the soil organic matter.
And so are there therefore, when you're thinking about different soil types rather than landscape or land use types, should we be looking at different kind of thresholds and potentials for soil carbon in different soils, and how should we be thinking about that?
Question. So sandy soils contain less carbon than sort of very clayey soils, sort of claggy soils, because the clay surfaces act as a surface to which the organic matter can adhere. So you tend to get more organic matter that are held in the soils that are high in clay and silt than the very sandy soils. Sandy soils that tend to have not as many places that can hold on to that organic matter. So it really does matter. The soil type matters in terms of how much carbon you would expect and how much carbon they can retain. So that also matters. That's a contextual thing that you need to consider. Say, wow, my carbon's really low. But you might say, well, this is a really sandy soil. All that sandy soils are really low in carbon, so maybe it's not in such bad a condition as we thought.
Do you think that should be or could be a consideration when we sort of want to plan around land use and net zero, in terms of where we might want to put our efforts when looking at kind of increasing soil carbon?
Yeah, I think it's important to consider the soil type and how much you can increase it. So as a good way of looking at it, there's a good way to do it. The best way to do it, in fact, is to just take a sample in the cropland and in the headlands that has not been cropped, and that will tell you for that same soil type how much carbon you would expect was in there before you started ploughing it up, and that gives you a good idea of how much you could then get back in. But we know from long-term experiments, there are some long-term experiments in Denmark in particular, one called Sandmarken at Asko, a place called Asko in Denmark, which is a very sandy soil. And they've been adding animal manure to it for over 100 years, but it's still not increased very much in soil carbon, just because that particular soil type can't hold on to that soil carbon. So however much you put on, it doesn't gain very much. Whereas another field at the same site, called Leermarken, which is another field at the same site, which is a more silty soil, that has increased in soil carbon quite a lot, receiving the same sort of treatment. So it really does matter, the soil type.
Are there systems that people can access to to kind of understand what the potential is, or would you just suggest that they kind of, you know, find the nearest sort of naturally undisturbed spot and work to that benchmark?
Yeah, if you wanted to measure your own benchmark, that would be the way to do it. To take measurements across, you know, your ploughed area and the area that was in the headland or in the local hedgerow or in a little area that was under forest on the same farm. But there are for different soil types. There are very good data sets out there available in the UK. You know, we've got them in all of the devolved nations. Good soil maps. Those soil maps have got characterized the organic matter content, bulk density, clay, as well as the soil type. So you can just interrogate these databases to say, for this soil type, under this land use, you might look at for a grassland or a semi-natural system, you could potentially have this much carbon. And in the croplands, you've got this much carbon. That tells you the gap. That is the gap that you can fill by improving the management to increase the soil carbon. You might never get it up to the original level, but it just gives you an indication of how much you can increase the carbon.
Yeah, just to be that much more targeted. That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. In your mind, are there practices that improve both soil health and soil carbon, or and I guess the converse of that, you know, are there practices that prioritize one at the expense of another?
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's a good question. So, yeah, there are things that you can do that increase the soil carbon that wouldn't improve the soil health. So you could take, for example, contaminated soil sludge and put that onto the soil. It would suppress all your microbial activity, so you wouldn't get any breakdown of the carbon. And because you're adding organic matter, the carbon would go up. So if you were just relying on carbon as an indicator of soil health, you'd say, hey, this is great, we've increased the soil carbon, but you've destroyed the soil health at the same time. So it's not a good, you know, it's not necessarily increasing the soil carbon doesn't necessarily improve the soil health. Having said that, generally speaking, if you're not adding something like toxic components to the soil, generally speaking, things that increase the soil organic matter tend to improve the soil health as well. So keeping the ground covered, having living roots in the system, trying to add back as much as you can organic matter. If you're taking, obviously, when you're taking grain away, that's carbon that you're taking away from the system. So trying to put back composts, municipal wastes, and other forms of mulches and such like are a great way of getting carbon back into the soil. So basically try to put back what you take away and keeping the ground covered and trying to disturb it as little as possible. So reducing the intensity of the tillage. And I'm not going to get drawn into the zero tillage, no zero tillage debate, because there's a lot of debate over that as contentious. But generally speaking, reducing the intensity of the tillage will increase your soil organic carbon, because you're not breaking open the aggregates, the little bits of soil that are glued together that sort of contain the organic matter. And the more you leave those intact, then the more sort of space you have to store carbon.
And will that increase the soil carbon in, you know, just to that certain depth, or does that start to feed down throughout the sort of profile of the soil?
Yeah, we don't have very good data on that. You would expect, I mean, most of the action is in the top, and if you're concentrating your activity in the top layer, that's where you'll get the largest increase in soil carbon. But you might expect to, over a very long time period, not anything before, you know, net zero by 2050, we wouldn't see it by then, but going out into the very long term, there would be some movement of organic matter down the profile, just through general, you know, movement through leaching and percolation down the profile. So you might expect that over time, maybe even over centuries, to increase the organic matter further down if you're increasing it in the top. But in the context of land use for net zero, if we're looking at a 2050 or mid-century sort of time scale, you probably wouldn't get an appreciable difference in the lower soils between now and then.
Is that a concern if the carbon is stored close to the surface? Is it more vulnerable to kind of, you know, being,
Yeah,
I guess, what are the circumstances in which that might then be released back?
yeah. Well, the good thing about soil carbon is that you can, you can increase it. The bad thing about soil carbon is it's very easily reversed.
Mm.
So if you stop doing the good practice, if you stop covering the soil, keeping living roots in there, returning the carbon to the soil, all those things that we said were good to increase the soil carbon, as soon as you stop doing that, your carbon starts running down again. So you can lose that carbon. You could perhaps lose it more quickly than you can gain it. So
Mm.
you have to, if you're going to engage on this process of improving your soil management, it has to be a permanent thing, and you have to persist. You have to continue doing that into the future. And
Mm.
that relates back to the point about it being in the topsoil. So the topsoil is where the carbon is stored. Most of the carbon is stored in the top 30 centimeters. Well, if you look at generally over lots of different soil types, it varies by soil type, but the top 30 centimeters contains about half of the carbon that you get to a meter. So 0 to 30 contains about half the carbon, and then 30 to 1 meter contains the rest of the carbon. That's the sort of proportions that you get, generally speaking.
The natural proportions.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, as a rule of thumb.
Mm.
But then that does make it more vulnerable to loss, because when you start ploughing it, you can even, if you have erosion, if you have wind or water erosion, if you have fires that sweep through and burn the surface, that they can all be sources of they can all be processes that cause the carbon to lose soils.
Mm. So those are both sort of sort of human instigated and natural, potentially sort of disasters that might cause
Yeah,
that
and we would
accumulation to be lost
That's
again.
right. And with climate change, we are expecting a greater frequency and magnitude of extreme events. Things
Mm.
that, large storms, rainfall events, floods, all of which can threaten future soil carbon stocks as well as biological carbon stocks in general.
In terms of the kind of maths of it, the kind of balance sheet, if you like, if you stored that carbon in the soil and then it's released back up, are you back to zero in terms of your carbon in, carbon out, or is
Pretty much.
it still,
Yeah,
yeah?
pretty much, because the soil carbon is the reason it's valuable from a climate change perspective and net zero perspective is you're locking up carbon that would otherwise be in the atmosphere. And if all that carbon is then going up into the atmosphere, either through increased oxidation, increased decomposition,
Mm.
or if it's eroded and doesn't get trapped in sediment, if it's then mixed up with stream water and then lost as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it's gone back into the atmosphere. So all the effort you made to put it into the soil over 20 years
Mm.
could be lost in one extreme event.
Mm.
So that's the reason why, I think increase in soil organic matter, increase in soil organic carbon is great. It's got so many co-benefits, but we shouldn't rely on it as a solution to climate change. It can help us, but we shouldn't put all our eggs in that basket.
Mm.
That's why we have to make emissions reduction across sectors of the economy
Yeah.
first, then think about soil carbon as adding that little bit of giving the carbon sink that can offset some of the remaining emissions that we have in the system.
Mm. Yeah. On that basis, I mean, would you propose sort of going along the soil health route in that case? Are you looking at soil carbon as part of how we get to, I don't know, resilience, just general healthy ecosystems?
Yeah.
A critical part of that, with potential co-benefits for net zero, for climate change, etc. But the focus to be on soil health, is that where your mind is?
Exactly. I think that you can either look at it from a carbon perspective and everything else is the co-benefit, or you can take it from the other point of view, from the farmer's point of view, maybe, who are thinking, if we got healthy soils, we've got healthier productivity, more fertile soils, more resilient soils to pass on to the next generation of farmers. That's perhaps more a useful way of looking at it. And the co-benefit is you get some carbon sequestration, but then you're not really. So it's really just a matter of perspective rather than what you actually do, because the practices that you do are probably pretty similar. But in terms of the the way you look at it. I think soil health is a good way of looking at it, and if you happen to get a co-benefit for carbon sequestration, for climate mitigation, that's a good thing.
Do you think it's possible for, I mean, there's a simple message in soil carbon, which is maybe a bit simpler than soil health. Do you think there's mileage in that being the focus, even though the outcome is around that soil carbon is the focus for practices, etc., even though the outcome is actually soil health? But soil carbon potentially is an easier thing to measure if you're doing it in a kind of more holistic way, and quite easy to communicate on, actually.
So as I mentioned, soil organic matter, which is basically the soil organic carbon, is the headline indicator of soil health. So to a certain extent, you do get that by saying if you're increasing your soil carbon, then generally you're making things better. Apart from a few examples that I gave earlier on, that is generally the case. But I think there's a danger of over focusing on soil carbon, because then it's all linked up with the carbon markets and can I get money from it, And I think that the danger of going down that route is that you forget the real reason that you're doing it, which is to improve the soil health. So I still think it's worth bringing them, and people say to me quite often, because I'm a soil carbon bloke, I work on soil carbon, they say don't forget about soil health, and I said, oh yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned that, of course. So I'm guilty of it too, just having my carbon blinkers on. You have to not have carbon blinkers on, you have to think about the bigger picture.
Well, I guess that's where we are with the environment generally, that we've thought about it in terms of one thing or another, but nature needs the whole of itself to carry on being, doesn't it? It's a system. And in your mind, do you think that in your experience, are you seeing farmers focus more on soil carbon, or is soil health really where a lot of farmers' mindsets are, or where do you think where do they fit in their journey?
I think probably on soil fertility even more than soil health. And soil fertility is another component of soil health, of course. But when you look at the tests that are done on farms, over the years they've tended to look at the pH, because that affects what you can grow, whether you need to lime, that affects your yield, and your fertility. How much nitrogen, potassium, and NPK and phosphorus. How much nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus you've got in the soil, as well as some other, micronutrients and such like. But that tends to be what farmers have got their fields tested for, because that's the thing that's going to affect their bottom line. So maybe farmers have been thinking in terms of soil fertility. The climate change people, like myself, have been thinking in terms of soil carbon. The ecologists have been thinking in terms of soil health. They're all related, but they're not the same concept. And depending on your perspective, one or more may be more important. But the bottom line is, if you've got a healthy soil, you're going to have a good nutrient supply. It's going to be good for growing your crops and for raising your livestock. So that can be your central focus. Yeah,
sure. I mean, we've talked a bit about the significance of land use on the potential of soil carbon, and its potential, and soil carbon's potential for different land uses. There's lots of focus on farming, of course, but there are lots of other really significant land uses. I mean, if we just stick with mineral soils rather than peat soils, do you think actually we should be thinking about different specific land uses in terms of their potential, that maybe they might be more static in terms of trajectory? A woodland hopefully will stay a woodland. Do you think other land uses should maybe be getting a little bit more of a limelight in terms of the soil carbon question?
So because the UK has such a vast area of grazing land, a lot of the attention from the soil carbon sequestration has been focused on the grasslands. It's actually, as I mentioned earlier, they tend to be fairly high in their carbon stock. They tend to be quite high to the total amount that you can get in them. Call it saturation or call it equilibrium, whatever. They're quite close to where you can get it up to. So there's not very much capacity to increase soil carbon in the grasslands. Whereas, as I've already mentioned, the croplands have lost about 40 to 60% of their carbon. So the cropland soils are the ones with a really large potential through a change in management to increase the carbon. So really, they should be the focus of our attention for increasing the soil carbon. They've got lower stocks, but that doesn't mean that they've got lower carbon sequestration potential, because this gap between what they can attain and what they've currently got is large, and that determines the sequestration potential. A lot of people think grasslands are great for carbon sequestration, because they're getting mixed up the fact that they contain a lot of carbon, but in fact the fact that they contain a lot of carbon means that there's less potential to increase carbon further. So that, I think, has been a bit of confusion, which has led some people to say, right, let's focus on grasslands. That's where we've got the best bang for our buck, which in a carbon sequestration potential point of view, that's not the case.
I guess following on from that, do you think there's a need and a role to think about other landscapes that hold a lot of soil carbon that potentially isn't measured and requires therefore greater long-term protections?
Yeah. Okay. Great. So in the languages of the people who talk about nature-based solutions, they talk about 4 interventions that you can make: you can protect, restore, manage, and create. So what we're talking about there is where you've got very large carbon stocks in your peatlands, in your forests, in your natural grasslands. The best thing you could do is leave them alone, protect them, and not plough them up, and not convert them to agriculture. So absolutely, that should be the primary focus. Let's protect what we've got first, because it's much easier to protect what you've got and stop it being lost than it is to try and scramble to get it all back again after you've lost it. The second one is restore, and that's where you've got a degraded system. So if you've got a degraded woodland or you've got a degraded peatland, 80% of our peatlands are degraded. I know you wanted to talk about mineral soils, but it's important to talk about peatlands too. That's where we can restore them, and we can immediately switch off the very large ongoing losses of carbon from those soils, and can eventually convert them into a situation where they're storing more carbon again. Either they're acting as a carbon sequestration source. So that's what we can do. So we protect their large ones, restore the sort of semi-natural systems that have been degraded, and then what we've been mostly talking about up until now is how we improve the management of our managed lands. So that's not just our croplands, that's also our grasslands, and also our woodlands and other areas that we manage.
Yeah, it's really interesting. In terms of agriculture, do you think where potentially agriculture can't make such an impact on soil carbon in terms of sequestration, are there sort of co-benefits in terms of emissions to agriculture that focuses on soil health and potentially building soil carbon?
So building soil carbon will generally make the soil healthier, increasing the organic matter, and you'll get better nutrient turnover. That doesn't necessarily mean that you impact emissions too much. We know that the other 2 main gases that are emitted from soils and agriculture are nitrous oxide, which is about nearly 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide, and methane, which is 25 to 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 100-year time span. So you have to think about what's happening to those gases. So it wouldn't be useful to increase the soil carbon if you were also increasing those other gases. So one study that I saw was proposing adding more fertilizer to soils to increase the amount of biomass growth, which would then in turn increase the amount of soil organic carbon. And that would be so dumb, because you would increase the nitrous oxide emissions from adding the nitrogen fertilizer. So it's really important to take if you're just looking at the climate impact, it's really important to take a full greenhouse gas balance at whatever intervention you're planning. to make sure that you're not doing something that's going to increase either the methane emissions or the nitrous oxide emissions, which could blow any benefit that you get in terms of carbon out of the water.
Yeah, are there any kind of, go-to sort of off-the-shelf or accessible kind of matrices of how to reach that sweet spot of doing the right thing and not unleashing unintended consequences, or just tipping that balance, I guess?
Yeah, well, generally speaking, things like keeping the ground covered and changing your tillage intensity don't have huge impacts on nitrous oxide and methane. So generally speaking, you could just focus on increasing the soil carbon. It's the ones where you're going to be doing things that you know are going to be increasing the emissions. So if you were going to be putting more ruminant animals into your system because you were trying to increase the amount of manure going onto the soil, which would increase the amount of carbon in the soil, it would increase the amount of carbon in the soil, but you'd blow all the benefits out of the water by the additional methane emissions from the ruminants. And that example that I mentioned, that when it was proposed to add more fertilizer to the system to increase the amount going into the increase of biomass that's going into the soil, would be blown out of the water by the nitrous oxide emissions. So generally speaking, we know the sort of practices that are going to increase other non-CO2 greenhouse gases. So anything that involves those should be avoided, and anything that doesn't really have a large impact on the other greenhouse gases would be relatively safe, I think.
Do you think that's those balances are well enough understood? In terms, I'm thinking of, the actual practicality of them. How does somebody know, when to go no further, and how to kind of reach that sweet spot?
Yeah, well, I think they're very different practices actually. So I don't know that you would have to, that you would reach a sweet spot. You'd have to think, I'm going to, over fertilize this field in order to increase the organic matter. And hopefully, your agronomy consultant would say, no, don't do that.
Yeah.
So I think it's at the level of which practices affect which greenhouse gases. I think the knowledge is already out there and fairly well established. The absolute balance between how much nitrous oxide would increase and how much carbon sequestration you would get, that's still that's the subject of hundreds or even thousands of agronomic experiments all over the world. That's the sort of thing that I'm involved in modeling and analyzing the data from those things. But we tend to know which things are good or bad for which gas.
And in your mind, when should we, or farmers even, measure soil carbon, and when should they measure soil health?
Well, it would be great to be able to measure soil health anywhere. That's why we have these indicators, these biological, chemical, and physical indicators, because they're the things that you either are already getting measured or they're fairly easy to measure. So that's the presence or absence of earthworms, the pH and the soil bulk density. All of those things can be fairly easily managed, and they give an indicator of the physical, chemical, and biological health of the soil. But that's still more effort than just taking a few samples and getting them sent off to a lab to measure the soil carbon. So I suppose it depends, again, like any question, it depends upon why you want the answer. So if you want the answer for carbon markets, you don't need to measure soil health. You just measure the carbon at the beginning before you've done your intervention, halfway through, and at the end when you've done your intervention, to demonstrate the amount of carbon you've increased in the soil. But if you're a farmer that's interested in the fertility and long-term resilience of your soil, and your resilience to future shocks and how you're going to be able to pass that on to the next generation, then it's maybe worth investing a little bit more to do those extra measures that will give you a better idea about how your soil health is, both as a snapshot, and also to monitor the change over time.
Yeah. And what are the different measures or ways of measuring soil carbon, and how good do you think they are demonstrating change in soil carbon?
Yeah, so the old way of doing it, the simplest way, is called loss on ignition. So basically, you take your soil, you dry it out, and then you burn off anything to the organic matter. You weigh it before and you weigh it again, and that's called your loss on ignition. And anything that you've lost can be assumed to be organic matter that you burned off when you did that loss on ignition. That's a pretty inexact estimate of soil carbon. There were some other ones that were during the 1950s and 1960s that were used that were titration methods. That's something called the Walkley-Black method. That's where you titrate it and then you estimate the soil carbon from that. But we've, over the past 20 years, we've got access to these super duper dry combustion analyzers, things like the LECO analyzer. Other other models are available, I should say, but these directly measure your soil carbon. So basically, you dry the soil, you grind it up, you stick it in your machine, and it tells you what your percentage carbon is. So that's the way that most of your commercial labs will do it these days. They'll measure it with a CNN analyzer. CNN stands for carbon and nitrogen, and that will give you your estimates of your carbon and your nitrogen from using a dry combustion method. But you don't need to know about any of that because you can just send it off and get your results back.
Sure. I should have asked you this earlier on, actually. So what's the difference between soil organic matter and soil carbon? How do they correlate, and how do we think about them?
Yeah. So soil organic matter contains about 58% carbon. So that's, it's an organic matter. So it's an organic material. It contains carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, a few other things, like all organic matter. And about soil organic matter in particular, about 58% is the soil carbon. So if you've got a rule of thumb is that if you've got a soil organic matter content of say 10 units, about 5.8 units of that will be carbon.
Right. So that's measurement. And so I think a lot of what you do is around modeling, which will seem, quite abstract to a lot of farmers and land managers. How does that work, and how sort of robust and transparent are the underlying models for doing that and for accounting around carbon?
Yeah, I suppose the models vary because they've been developed for different purposes. The ones that are developed for research, which are the ones that I mainly work with, are not very transparent because they're used by scientists. And they're based on, you take measurements and you've got inputs of meteorological data, your rainfall, your temperature, and it simulates the turnover of carbon, how much is being lost to CO2 and how much is being humidified and how much is being locked up in the soil. So that's basically what they do. All of the models do that in different ways. And that's the idea, that you can simulate changes, because it takes ages to measure a change in soil carbon, because you've got a small change against a very long background, a very large background of soil carbon. It could take maybe 10 years to measure a change in soil carbon. And of course, if you want to show that you're doing something, something beneficial to the soil, quite often you need to model how that's going to change out into the future. So models aren't a replacement for measurements. They're only as good as the measurements you give them to initialize them. But they can help you work out your trajectory, and they can also help you experiment with different management interventions you can do. So because they have the impacts of, ground cover or tillage practice, different crop types, different fertilizer types built into them, you can model what would happen to your soil carbon if you did each one of these interventions, and that can help you make the right decision for your specific circumstance and soil type about what the best measurement would be to increase the soil organic matter and how much you might expect to increase it.
So what protocols are used in measuring and accounting for soil carbon?
Yeah, there are a few out there. So the Australian Greenhouse Gas Program, that's a national government program, has a protocol for measuring and modelling your soil carbon change. There are others out there. For example, Vera which works on the voluntary carbon market, has a protocol for determining soil carbon change. So there are a bunch of different different methodologies or protocols out there for demonstrating a change in soil carbon. Most of them linked to carbon markets, because if you're going to be getting money for it, you have to be sure that you're demonstrating a change in soil carbon. So that's why these protocols have been developed. There's for farmers, I think they're quite often too complex to use. So they can be used by companies that are selling, millions of tons worth of carbon, soil carbon, because they're operating across very large landscapes or thousands of farmers. But they're probably too complicated to use at the individual farm level. But there are services out there available. People who use models, use remote sensing, use different procedures, different calculation procedures, who could tell you what changes you could make to improve the soil carbon. But let's not forget about soil health. That's what we started talking about. That only tells you about the carbon. It doesn't tell you about the health.
Do you think there's an equivalent for raw and interest in measuring soil health?
I think that would be really useful. I mean, there are protocols for measuring soil health, which use these simple indicators, and for assessing the change over time. But I think it's because we're talking about a bunch of different things. With soil carbon, it's just talking about one element, carbon, in the soil. With soil health, we're talking about whole different bunch of physical, chemical, and biological changes that can occur in the soil. So you would have to have you'd have to be able to account for all of those. So you'd need a slightly more complex model, and the model would also have to respond to land use change and land management change in the same way as the carbon models do. So I think that's a challenge for the research community to come up with that.
And of course, soil type and the original.
Absolutely, all that,
Where do you think, in terms of going back to soil carbon, where do you think more research or evidence is needed to make things just generally clearer for people?
I still think we need better systems for monitoring, reporting, and verification. So not just for the carbon markets, if you want to sell carbon, but I think these sort of, we've got all the components. We've got good measurements of soil carbon. We've got great databases. We've got repeat samples in certain places. We've got good models in the research community, in the science community. We've got good on-farm data that the farmers collect for their, to get their single farm payments and such like. But nobody's ever really brought all this together. So if we were able to bring all those strands together, I think we'd have a great way to sort of, at the farm level up to the national level, would have a great platform to pull all these different streams of data together to get and combine with remote sensing to get a really good platform to monitor, report, and verify the soil carbon. That would be a game changer. That would allow individual farmers to just plug in their location, plug in this, what they're doing, and all the other underlying data would be in the system. And then that would for the voluntary carbon markets, that would provide something that would be, could provide confidence to the investors that the soil carbon was changing and was being sequestered in a sustainable way. And for the national inventory, the people who are interested in how much carbon we're offsetting to offset the remaining emissions that may still be in the mix at 2045, 2050, that would give them confidence in the numbers that were going into the national inventory. So we don't have that yet. We require a little investment and a few people to start to work together, but it's not miles away, because I think we have the individual components.
Would that be a task that's sort of focused around harmonisation, standardisation, a little bit of compromise between systems that are already up and running in order to get things to work together rather than reinventing something?
Yeah, definitely. Because as I say, these individual components work, but as there's a good point there, you mentioned harmonisation. You've got different ways of measuring, different depths to measure between the systems and the different protocols. So pulling those together or harmonising them in a way, getting I was going to say fudge factors. That's not the right word. Getting translation factors that allow you to convert one measurement system to another measurement system to get them all harmonised in a way that everyone can understand and is speaking about the same thing. That's the first thing that we need to do. But then pulling together all this stuff that's, the remote sensing community, looking for uses for their products, and the researchers are looking for ways to use their models and their knowledge, and the farmers are desperately asking for information. Anybody can help, so it's really putting those together. And that's what I'm hoping we can do, at least start to do. We're not going to complete that, but we can at least start that journey as part of the soils tag, as the under the LUNZ hub. So I'm hoping we can start that process.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something we hear very often, I think, encapsulated in the idea that, we don't need the third decimal on soils anymore. We just we've got this amazing wisdom, work, knowledge, resources. They just need organizing.
Exactly.
So people can start to really use them. Well, so final question. There's a perception that we come across from quite often, actually, that other countries are making kind of quicker and stronger progress on soil carbon than in the UK. Why do you think that is?
Well, there are a number of reasons that could be, but an easy answer to it is that, or why we should be perhaps moving faster, is that we're probably waiting until we've got a system that's fully set up, where we're absolutely confident that we can monitor, report, and verify the soil carbon change. But we know that changing the soil organic matter content is good. It's going to have multiple co-benefits. It's going to be good for soil health. So we could start that journey towards increasing the soil organic matter in our soils, because it's a no regret strategy. It's going to be a good thing for the soils, a good thing for farmers anyway. So I think that the countries that are further ahead of us are maybe just leaping in with a bit of faith that this is going to get sorted. So let's start making the change now. And I think, we shouldn't let perfection be the enemy of progress. We can, as I said, we've got the components of a different for MRV systems, monitoring, reporting, and verification systems around. And if we pull those together, we should have something that's possible to demonstrate a soil carbon in maybe 5-10 years time. And it will take that long for the soil carbon to change and to be measurable anyway. So I think we could, if we believe in it, and we've got every reason to believe in it from the scientific point of view, we know we've got evidence that it will improve our soils and improve our environment, then we should be, in my opinion, we should be moving towards improving our soil health and worrying about how we're going to monitor, report, and verifying it in parallel. But we shouldn't just wait until we've got all the solutions before we start the progress in improving our soils.
Brilliant. So in terms of soil organic matter and soil carbon being mostly stored sort of in that higher upper, more topsoil layer, are there any ways of getting it down to the lower layers of soil where it might potentially be more stable? Sort of dragging it down more through farming systems and creating that kind of bottom up carbon resource.
Yeah. So the radical answer is you can completely invert the soil, and there's been an experiment done in New Zealand where they completely inverted the top meter. So they recognized the fact they've increased the soil carbon in the topsoil, and just as an experiment, they completely inverted it to trap the soil carbon that's been increased in the lower layers, where it decomposes more slowly because it's colder, it's further away from the surface, there's a lot less oxygen, and then allow the carbon to increase in the top. Now that was just an experiment to see if it could be done, and it can be done. But of course, then you're exposing the layer that's not as fertile, the one that was at the bottom. So that's not going to be very good for farming, and I don't think farmers are going to be very interested in it. But it was an interesting experiment, and in a way, it's the opposite of minimum tillage, isn't it? It's like ultimate massive tillage, where you turn the whole profile over. But the easiest way, I should say, the most common way of getting carbon deeper into the soil is through deep rooted plants. So if you can get crops or more diverse swards, if you're in a grassland, with some very deep rooted species, that should be putting more carbon deeper in the soil. And that's the big unknown, really. How much carbon is stored there, because people don't generally measure it. It's breaking work to dig a pit to 1 meter. That's why the auger is generally just stuck into the top layer, partly because that's where the action is, and partly because that's easier. But there is some potential to increase the amount that's going down into the soils if we could get more deep-rooted crops, and even crops with more recalcitrant roots, those that decompose less quickly. So the Salk Institute in the US has been looking at increasing the concentration of compounds in the roots that are much more resistant to decomposition. So that's actually actively being researched as a way of increasing soil carbon sequestration by increasing the or decreasing the decomposability of the roots, getting them deeper into the ground.
Brilliant. And I guess coming back to the soil health question, presumably all these practices have to go hand in hand with husbandry, and are there circumstances where, by trying to follow a practice for one outcome, you could compromise soil health? I'm thinking about, potentially, cover crop sowing in bad weather conditions, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so it's going to be horses for courses in terms of what you can do. So cover crops tend to go in and are ploughed in the spring, which could be, when we've had a very wet spring like we've had all over the UK this year, that could compromise your ability to get onto the soil. I suppose that happens whether you've got a cover crop there or not. That could affect the workability of the soil. But yeah, it has to be, obviously you have to make sure that the operations and the different management practices that you choose fit in with your conditions, and you don't necessarily know what those are going to be in advance. But that's what farmers are dealing with, that sort of variability all day, every day.
Thanks so much, Pete. Well, that was it for today for our talking heads on soil for the LUNZ soil tag. We're going to be digging into more issues, opening other cans of worms, mudding more waters. Any more, Pete? So anything that anybody would like to hear about in terms of soil, do get in touch, and we'll have a chat.